What does it say? As unattainable as Berlin. Huh, wow. And that's official, yeah? Official. I detect some sarcasm there, you know? Huh? Yeah, official sarcasm. Yeah. Okay. July 15th, 1944. Fear. It can make people do seemingly unthinkable things. This week in the Marianas, it makes thousands of civilians kill themselves rather than be taken into custody by the Americans. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviets took Minsk, but they were advancing all over in Poland and Belarusia, though there was a bit of a lull in Finland. In the west, the Allies struggled to reach Saint-Lô and to take Caen continued, and the battle for Saipan ended in an American victory after the Japanese desperately launched their largest banzai charge ever. But though the battle there has ended, the slaughter has not. See, there are still thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians hiding out in the caves in the north of the island. They will not give up to the Americans, for they think that if they do, they will be killed or worse. So to avoid capture, on the 9th at Marpi Point, now known as Suicide Cliff if you look it up, they commit mass suicide. American soldiers watched disbelievingly as women and children hurled themselves from the 800-foot cliffs. Soldiers pulled the pins on their own grenades, and mothers with infants in arms struggled across the rocks into the sea rather than let themselves be captured. The total loss of life the past couple weeks on Saipan climbs to over 50,000 from this, only 3,000 of those being American lives, but with the 13,000 American wounded, this is the most costly American Pacific operation so far. But that is not considered too high a price to pay for an airbase that brings Tokyo within range of B-29 bombers. The delayed stages of Operation Forager, attacks on Tinian and Guam, are set to go off soon. Another operation, Charnwood, began late last week. This is an Allied move to liberate Caen. Now, Kurt Meyer's 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend is running the defense there. Here's what James Holland has to say about Meyer and his division at this point. His 12th SS had long since reached a point where it could no longer properly function. His Panzer Grenadier Regiment 26 had been reduced to the strength of a weak single battalion. It had arrived in Normandy with 3 full-strength battalions. His panzer strength had been reduced by about 3/4. His reconnaissance battalion had just 1 mixed company left, perhaps 100 men, while his combat engineer battalion had been effectively annihilated. 1 entire battalion of artillery had also been obliterated. Ammunition was low, and his entire division had been reduced to that of a Kampfgruppe. Only Panzer Grenadier Regiment 25, still defending the western half of Caen, remained in reasonable order. After the attacks began, Meyer again asked his superior Sepp Dietrich if he could evacuate, and Dietrich said no. Meyer has now disobeyed this order and ordered his men to pull out. He writes this: the soldiers of 12th SS Panzer Division were at the end of their physical endurance. They had gone to war weeks before with fresh, blooming faces. At this point, camouflaged, muddy steel helmets cast shade on emaciated faces whose eyes had all too often looked into another world. The men presented a picture of deep human misery. But for all that, those men defending Caen have prevented any Allied progress east or south on this end of the line for a full month, which is pretty impressive. As the week begins on the 9th, there is heavy fighting in the northern suburbs of the city, but progress is slow. By now, it was abundantly clear that any attempt to take the city of Caen by direct assault or by outflanking thrusts to the east or west was not going to succeed unless it was delivered with overwhelming force, a force that would involve the virtual destruction of the city. So that is what has happened. And 267 RAF bombers dropped more than 2,500 tons of bombs on the city center, reducing it to rubble. Then the 3rd British Division on the left 59th in the center, and 3rd Canadian on the right, with 2 armored brigades in support, move forward to end the stalemate once and for all. By the evening of the 9th, all 3 divisions are in the city proper and up to the west bank of the Orne. So much of Caen has finally fallen, but the southern suburbs and the other side of the river are still in German hands. West of Caen, over the next couple days, Miles Dempsey's forces crossed the Odon and managed to take half of Hill 112 at a high cost in casualties. And though a numbered hill might not sound like a major thing, General Heinrich Eberbach, who took over command of Panzer Group West last week, calls it the pivotal point of the entire position, which must not, under any circumstances, be surrendered. As for the American attacks towards Saint-Lô, which also began last week, they have caused German commander in France, Günther von Kluge, to move the Crack Panzer Lehr Division over there. They arrived the 11th and go into action along 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, who themselves just recently arrived. This is not good news for Allied Ground Forces Commander Bernard Montgomery. See, while he has, of course, wanted to gain ground in the east at and near Caen, his overriding mission has been to tie down the panzers there so the Americans can make progress in the west. And those panzers have obviously not been tied down. Anyhow, as I said last week, L'Aille du Puy finally falls the 9th, but U.S. 8th Corps is having real struggles gaining ground. So Corps Commander Troy Middleton replaces the commanders of 8th and 90th Divisions and a bunch of regimental commanders too. On the 14th, 8th Corps reaches the Leuze-Perrières line. The U.S. official history has this to say about that. When the grinding attack through the hedgerows ceased, at least temporarily, on July 14th, Coutances, 14 miles to the south, seemed as unattainable as Berlin. 7th Corps is trying to reach the Perrières-Saint-Loup road. Here's what the U.S. official history says about that. At the rate of advance made in the preceding week, the final objective was at least a month and a half distant. 19th Corps is tasked with taking the Coutances-Saint-Loup-Bayeux road near Saint-Gilles and the high ground west of Saint-Loup. They have made advances, which threaten to outflank the Germans, hence Panzer Lehr being sent over. The Panzer Lehr attack the 11th is strong, but is pretty much contained by the end of the day. The 12th, the U.S. 19th, and 7th Corps begin their advances again. By today, they can see the Perrières-Saint-Loup highway. It had taken almost 2 weeks and a great quantity of lives to advance some 10 miles. But at last, the First Army were in position to move on Saint-Loup. Before this happened, there were more changes in the Corps boundaries as everyone shifted to the east. Collins' 7th Corps passed the Carentan-Perrières Isthmus to 8th Corps and took charge of the front between the Tote and the Vire. East of the Vire, 19th Corps and 5th Corps were making that final bid for Saint-Loup, a city which by some calculations should have been in American hands by D+9. It was now D+41, and the city had still to be taken. Erwin Rommel writes to Hitler from France that no new men can be brought over without weakening 15th Army's Channel defenses or the Mediterranean front. So what are they going to do? Here's the thing though. This means 15th Army is still expecting to meet an invasion further up the Channel. So Allied deception is still working even 5 weeks after the Normandy landings. Rommel does ask Hitler to bring over the 28,000 German troops currently stationed on the Channel Islands, but Hitler says no. Rommel bluntly sums things up. The troops are everywhere fighting heroically, but the unequal struggle is approaching its end. Okay, if it is, then it's a pretty slow approach. Down in Italy, on the 9th, the US 88th Division takes Volterra, and the French on their right advance on Poggibonsi, which they take the 14th, then Castellina. Further inland as the week ends, 8th Army units are attacking Arezzo. Of course, the Soviet attacks and advances also continue this week. They reach the outskirts of Vilnius as the week gets going and put it under siege. Permission to break out of Vilnius is not granted by Hitler until the 11th. The next night, 6th Panzer Division attacks from outside the city and creates a temporary gap in the enemy lines. Some 3,000 German troops escape the city, but more than 12,000 are lost when the city is taken by the Soviets the 13th. Already the 9th, German Army Group Center Commander Walter Model asks to move Army Group North south of the Dwina to beef up his own lines and prevent North from being cut off by the Soviet drive to the Baltic. But Hitler rejects this. The evening of the 10th, Andrei Yeremenko's Second Baltic Front begins attacks against the southern extension of the Panther Line, manned by the 13 divisions of German 16th Army. In 48 hours, he has torn an 80-kilometer gap in the Axis lines more than 15 kilometers deep, taking Idritsa the 12th and Opochka today as the week ends. Opochka was a major strongpoint in the Panther Line, so now there's a gap in the Axis defense system protecting the Latvian border region. This is a big deal. Okay, let me backtrack a bit here, right? Stavka has plans to eliminate Army Group North, with staggered offensives coming from 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts, and the Leningrad front driving into the Narva Isthmus. Ivan Bagramian commands 1st Baltic, and he sees some big flaws with the master plan. Where the Germans have their greatest strength, in the north, is where the Soviet attacks will be relatively weaker and come later. Also, there are planned attacks towards Kaunas to isolate Army Group North and protect a drive on Warsaw, while 2nd and 3rd Baltic fronts would push back Army Group North towards East Prussia. And this sticks in Bagramian's craw. In what way would isolating Kaunas isolate Army Group North? And what he says it would do in reality is expose his flank and his rear to great danger, growing greater the further west 1st Baltic advances. Well, he fails to convince Stavka, and last week on the 5th, his offensive began. This week on the 9th, they cut the Dvinsk-Vilnius railway line, and by the 12th, his armies are in action along his whole front, aiming at Dvinsk and Ukmerg. Now, Johannes Friesner took command of Army Group North last week from Georg Lindemann, and he tells Hitler the 12th that he cannot make a stable defense anywhere south of Ostrov, and if they want to save the armies of Army Group North, then they should pull the Narva Group by sea down to Riga or Memel, and pull 16th and 18th armies back to the Riga-Kaunas line. Hitler says no. We didn't see that coming, did we? No. Hitler says no. But for all these offensives getting going in the north, something huge is getting going in the south. On the 13th, the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive begins. The final plans for this offensive were only sent from Ivan Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front to Stavka the 7th and are approved on the 10th. The heavy concentration of forces by the 1st Ukrainian Front made any strategic deception operation, such as the masking of Operation Bagration, impossible. Instead, the Soviets attempted to convince the Germans that the main thrust would emanate from the southern wing towards Stanisław, rather than against Lvov. This effort was only partially successful. The Germans did not detect that the 1st Guards Army had been shifted northward, and they missed several other new force concentrations. Besides the main thrust against Lvov, Konyev planned a significant secondary drive by the 3rd Guards Army. We saw for many weeks that the Soviets fooled the Axis into thinking that the main summer offensive was going to fall in the south, and then the subsequent Soviet demolition of Army Group Center when it didn't. But this attack in the south is indeed also a major one. Now, on the 12th, the Germans begin pulling troops out of the forward trench lines, since they know Soviet tactics, and if and when a big assault begins, it will be preceded by a huge artillery barrage targeting just those lines. Konyev, however, gets word of this and thinks, screw it, no barrage, and infantry attacks begin the 13th by 3rd Guards Army and 13th Army. Unlike the Operation Bagration attacks, here the Germans have good artillery support and also good air support. So the fighting is pretty intense, but after 2 days of it, the Soviets managed to take Gorokhov and surround Brody. 13th Army actually manages to tear a gap in the German lines, and into that gap this evening, as the week ends, Konyev sends Cavalry Mechanized Group Baranov. He also sends the undetected 1st Guards Tank Army under Mikhail Katukov into action further north the 13th, where the recon companies have discovered the forward enemy defense areas unmanned. Over the rest of the week, they head northwest of Brody, running into the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, but they penetrate like 20 kilometers. and do some serious damage to those divisions. The last 2 days of the week, though the German defenses east of Lvov hold, Josef Harpe, acting commander of Army Group North Ukraine, sends in his main tactical reserve, which is the 1st and 8th Panzer Divisions. We'll see next week if they can hold off the Red Army from the city. And even up in the far north in Finland, the fighting continues. The Finns give up the right bank of the Vuoksi to the Soviets, who also make a bridgehead on the north side of the river. The Finns cannot eliminate this, so they hope to at least contain it. By now, the fronts on both sides of Lake Ladoga are somewhat stabilizing. The Soviets are also replacing their better units with garrison units to bring men south. So the tempo of the offensive in general is diminishing. But keep in mind, the Finns cannot win a battle of attrition here. They do not have more reserves to throw into the fray. And the only likely way they can hold out is if they get more men from Germany. And that is up to Adolf Hitler, the man who runs Germany. This week on the 11th, Klaus von Stauffenberg goes to Berchtesgaden to report to Hitler. He brings a bomb with him, but he does not use it. Hitler is going to go to Rastenburg, and so is Stauffenberg. And today, the 15th, is the day Operation Valkyrie is to be executed, the assassination of Hitler and the takeover of the German government. However, Hitler shortens the length of the Rastenburg conference at the last moment. So Stauffenberg postpones the attempt for 5 days until his next trip to Rastenburg next week. There's a lot more to this. Astrid covers all this in great depth this month on our Spies and Ties series. Check that out. There's dynamite exploding in Italy this week, though. Good segue, yeah? On the 12th, 48 partisans are captured near Arezzo. They are tortured for 2 days, but do not give up any information. So they are forced to dig a pit, and then they're buried up to their necks. Sticks of dynamite are put beside their heads. They still refuse to talk, so their captors light the fuses of the dynamite. As for the world of war crimes, which Spartacus covers in our War Against Humanity series in depth, on the 11th, Winston Churchill has shown more details from the 4 escapees from Auschwitz about the murder there of 1.7 million Jews over the past 2 years. He writes to Anthony Eden, "There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. And it has been done by scientific machinery, by nominally civilized men in the name of a great state and one of the leading races in Europe. It is quite clear that all concerned in this crime who may fall into our hands, including the people who only obeyed orders by carrying out the butcheries, should be put to death after their association with the murders has been proved." And with that, I will bring us to the end of the week. Of mass suicide on Saipan, most of Caen falling in the west, a whole load of places falling in the east, as big operations in both the north and the south get going, and a plot to kill Hitler pushed back a week. And on the 11th, American President Franklin Roosevelt announces that he will recognize Charles de Gaulle's provisional French government as the authority for civil administration in liberated France. He also tells a press conference that he will run for a 4th presidential term if nominated. The Americans still have Myitkyina under siege, and the Japanese still have Hanyang under siege. The Chinese have sent the 62nd and 79th Armies to help fight the attackers at Hanyang. The 62nd arrives tomorrow. But with the 79th arriving much slower, the Japanese make short work of the 62nd, and they will be forced to retire before they can make contact with the troops of Fang Xiangyue's 10th Army in the city. Okay, that's the future. I am going to quote something else from the future here from next week on July 22nd. Spooky. 16 captured German generals, captured by the Soviets, write an appeal to the German army, laying out just how much of a disaster Operation Bagration has been. I found this in John Erickson, by the way. The appeal says this: the destruction of 30 divisions, in other words, almost the whole of the army group, the whole of the 4th Army, the bulk of the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Army. In these unequal battles, 21 generals, including ourselves, were taken prisoner and more than 10 others killed. Reasons for this renewed defeat: a wrong interpretation of the enemy's strategic possibilities and intentions. Our flank positions threatened ever since winter, lack of reserves and Luftwaffe support. To put it briefly, Army Group Center was sacrificed in a game of chance. The other year, we did a series following the Cuban Missile Crisis day by day in real time, and there was a real chance there that a lot more than an army group might have been sacrificed. If you have not seen that, then go over to our Time Ghost History channel and check it out, for it is in fact awesome. The link will pop up any second now right here. It is the Time Ghost Army that allows us to do that series and this series and all our series. So for ever more of this, join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers, and Nico Laser is the Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.